Nightmare in the Canadian Rockies. For nearly a decade, I've been behind the wheel of a rig, crisscrossing highways and back roads, witnessing all the oddities the open road can throw at you. I thought I'd seen it all, until that night in the Canadian Rockies. The events of that night still linger in my mind, a haunting reminder that some things defy explanation. It was an experience that still gives me chills every time I think about it, and it's one of those stories that makes you question what's real and what's not. It was a late summer night, and I was driving through the heart of the Canadian Rockies. The road was a ribbon of asphalt winding through the mountains, flanked on both sides by dense forests that seemed to swallow the light. The sky was clear, but the only thing lighting my way was the dull glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had just passed through a small town, one of those places you barely notice on the map, and I figured it would be a while before I hit any semblance of civilization again. My stomach was rumbling, and I could feel the pressure of a full bladder, but I hadn't noticed any rest stops since leaving the town. The road was completely deserted, and the only sound was the steady hum of my truck's engine. I desperately needed a smoke break. After driving for an eternity, I decided it was time to pull over. The road ahead stretched out into the abyss, and I hadn't seen a single car for miles. It was as good a place as any to have my break. I eased my truck to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the gravel as I brought it to a stop. After a quick glance around to make sure I was alone, I hopped out, leaving the engine running for light. The cool night air hit me as I stood there, staring out into the pitch-black forest that bordered the highway. The trees seemed to loom over me, their silhouettes barely visible against the inky sky. I stepped a few feet away from the truck and relieved myself, feeling a strange sense of unease as I did. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way in the mountains. There was something about the vastness of the wilderness that made you feel incredibly small and vulnerable. As I zipped up, I shook off the feeling and reached into my pocket for a cigarette. I lit it, the tiny flame from the lighter flickering in the breeze before the cigarette caught. I took a long drag, letting the smoke fill my lungs as I stared out into the darkness. That's when I saw him. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe just my tired mind conjuring up shadows in the trees. But as I squinted into the darkness, I realized there was no mistake. A figure, a man, was walking out of the tree line, slowly and deliberately, heading straight towards me. My heart skipped a beat, and every instinct screamed at me to get back into the truck. I'd heard stories about people living off-grid in the wilderness, hermits who shunned society and had no qualms about taking what they needed from passersby. And here I was, miles from civilization, with only patchy cell service and no one around to help if things went south. I flicked the cigarette to the ground and calmly walked back to the truck, forcing myself not to break into a run. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and climbed inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked all the doors and put the truck in drive, ready to speed off at the first sign of trouble. But something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the irrational thought that if I just stayed put, everything would be okay. I kept my eyes on the man as he approached, my heart pounding in my chest. The truck's headlights illuminated his face, and I could see that he was disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, with wild eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. He walked right up to the passenger side door and knocked on the window. The sound was sharp, almost urgent, and I jumped in my seat. I stared at him for a moment, weighing my options. Finally, I rolled the window down just a crack, enough to hear him, but not enough for him to reach inside. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need you to call the cops," he replied, his tone deadly serious. I blinked in surprise. That was the last thing I expected to hear. "Why?" I asked cautiously. He let out a shaky breath and glanced back at the woods. "I went out into the forest to bleep myself," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I couldn't go through with it. I thought of my daughters, and I couldn't do it." My heart sank as I watched him struggle to hold back tears. There was something so raw and vulnerable about him that I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Where's the knife?" I asked, my eyes scanning his hands. He hesitated for a moment before lifting his shirt and revealing a large kitchen knife tucked into his waistband. "I was going to use this," he said quietly. "Maybe you should put it on the ground before the cops get here," I suggested, keeping my tone calm and level. He nodded slowly, almost as if he was in a daze, and carefully placed the knife on the ground beside the truck. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling with the touchscreen as I dialed 911. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation, giving them our location as best as I could. They assured me that they would send someone out right away, but I knew it would take time for them to reach us. As I waited, I kept talking to the man, trying to keep him calm. He told me about his life, how he had lost his job, his wife had left him, and he had become estranged from his daughters. He had come out to the mountains to end it all, but in the end, the thought of his girls had stopped him. The minutes dragged on, and the air in the truck felt heavy with tension. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching in the distance. I let out a sigh of relief and watched as the car pulled up behind my truck. Two officers got out and approached cautiously, their hands on their holsters. I rolled down the window and gestured to the man. "He's over here," I said. The officers spoke to him quietly, their voices too low for me to hear. One of them picked up the knife and handed it to the other, who placed it in an evidence bag. They then led the man to the back of the police car, where he sat down without a struggle. As they were about to leave, the man turned back to me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. I nodded, not knowing what else to say. The police car pulled away, and I watched the taillights disappear into the night. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to process what had happened. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, and one detail stood out to me: the way he had looked back at the woods when he mentioned his daughters. I started the truck and pulled back onto the highway, my mind racing. The thought of that look kept gnawing at me, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story than he had let on. A few miles down the road, I saw another set of flashing lights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was an ambulance, and my stomach dropped. I pulled over again, unable to resist the urge to find out what was going on. I stepped out of the truck and approached the scene. A paramedic was wheeling a gurney toward the back of the ambulance, and I caught a glimpse of the body on it. The man's face was covered, but there was no mistaking who it was. "Hey," I called out to the paramedic. "What happened?" The paramedic glanced at me, then at the body. "They found him just off the road, about a mile back," he said grimly. "Looks like he bleeped with a kitchen knife." I stared at him in shock. But I just saw him. I called the cops, and they took him away." The paramedic frowned. "I don't know what to tell you, man. The cops found him like this. They said they were responding to a call about a guy trying to bleep himself, but when they got there, he was already gone." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the paramedic loaded the body into the ambulance. The flashing lights cast eerie shadows on the trees, and suddenly, the forest didn't seem so empty anymore. I got back in my truck and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even now, I still wonder about that night. Who, or what, was the man I spoke to? Was it a trick of the mind, a desperate attempt to rationalize the impossible? Or was there something more sinister at play? I guess I'll never know for sure. But one thing's for certain, there are some roads you should never travel alone.
I've been a trucker for nearly 15 years, and in that time I've seen almost everything the road can throw at you. I've hauled everything from furniture to livestock and driven through every state in this country. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on that stretch of highway between Nevada and Utah. It started like any other haul. I was carrying a load of electronics from San Francisco to Denver, a route I'd driven countless times. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. The highway stretched out in front of me, a seemingly endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren land. I flipped on the radio, hoping to catch some local news or music to keep me company. The signal was patchy, but I found a classic rock station. The familiar strains of Lynyrd Skynyrd's Free Bird filled the cab, and I settled into my seat, enjoying the solitude of the open road. About an hour into my drive, I spotted something up ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a deer. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A woman, standing on the side of the road, her thumb outstretched in the universal gesture for a ride. I usually don't pick up hitchhikers, but something about this woman seemed different. She looked desperate, her clothes dusty and torn, her face streaked with dirt. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. "Need a lift?" I called out the window. She nodded vigorously and scrambled into the passenger seat, thanking me profusely. As she settled in, I noticed she was shaking, her eyes darting nervously around the cab. "I'm Jenny," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you so much for stopping. I didn't think anyone would." "No problem," I replied, giving her a reassuring smile. "I'm Tom. Where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here," she muttered, glancing out the window. "I just need to get away as fast as possible." As we drove, Jenny gradually began to open up. She told me she was escaping an abusive relationship and that she had finally managed to run away from her boyfriend after years of torment. She had been hiding in the desert for days, trying to evade him. "I couldn't stay there any longer," she said, her voice cracking. "I had to get away. He would have taken me out." I felt a surge of sympathy for her. I had heard stories like hers before, but it was different hearing it firsthand. I promised her I would get her to safety, that she didn't have to worry anymore. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. I glanced over at Jenny from time to time, noticing how she seemed to relax bit by bit as we put more distance between us and whatever she was running from. As night fell, I spotted a roadside diner up ahead. My stomach rumbled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I figured Jenny could use a meal too, so I pulled in and parked the truck. "How about we grab a bite to eat?" I suggested. Jenny hesitated, but then nodded. "Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, Tom." We entered the diner, and the bell above the door jingled. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and an elderly couple in a booth. We found a seat by the window, and a waitress came over with menus. As we waited for our food, Jenny seemed to grow more at ease. She even managed a small smile when the waitress brought our burgers and fries. We ate in relative silence, but it was a comfortable silence. After dinner, we got back on the road. It was late, and the highway was almost deserted. Jenny had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind kept drifting back to her story. Suddenly, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A car was approaching fast, its high beams glaring. I squinted, trying to make out the make and model, but it was too dark. The car pulled up close behind me, tailgating dangerously. I heard the horn honking, and a guy yelling out the window for me to pull over. "What the hell?" I muttered, glancing over at Jenny. She was still asleep, oblivious to the car behind us. I tried to ignore the car, but it kept pace with me, its headlights blinding in my mirrors. Then it swerved into the other lane, pulling up alongside my truck. I glanced over and saw a man behind the wheel, his face twisted in anger. My heart sank. It was Jenny's boyfriend. How did he find us? I thought to myself. I slammed my foot on the gas, trying to outrun him. The truck roared to life, but the car stayed right beside us. Jenny woke up, her eyes wide with fear. "Tom, what's going on?" "Hang on, Jenny," I said, my voice tense. "I think it's him." She looked over and saw the car, her face going pale. "Oh my God, it's him, it's him." The car rammed into the side of the truck, and I struggled to keep control. Jenny was screaming, and I could barely hear myself think. I needed to lose this guy, and fast. I spotted an exit up ahead and took it, hoping to lose him on the back roads. The car followed, its headlights still glaring. We tore down a narrow, winding road, the truck's tires screeching on the asphalt. The road ended at an abandoned warehouse. I had no choice but to stop. I jumped out of the cab, Jenny right behind me. The car skidded to a halt, and her boyfriend got out, a crazed look in his eyes. "Get behind me," I told Jenny, stepping forward. "She's mine," he screamed, brandishing a tire iron. "You can't take her from me." I had no weapon, nothing to defend us with, but I couldn't let him take Jenny. I stood my ground, my heart pounding. "Stay away from her," I warned. If he got a hold of her, I could never forgive myself. He lunged at me, swinging the tire iron. I dodged, barely, and grabbed his arm, trying to wrestle the weapon from him. We struggled, the metal clanging against the concrete. Jenny screamed, but there was nothing she could do. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, I managed to knock the tire iron from his hand. He fell to the ground and I stood over him, breathing heavily. "Go," I told Jenny. "Get in the truck. Call the police." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and ran to the truck. Her boyfriend lay on the ground, groaning, but I didn't take my eyes off him. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing. They handcuffed Jenny's boyfriend and took our statements. We were shaken but relieved it was over. As they led him away, he looked back at Jenny with a strange smile. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think you're safe? You're wrong. I'll never let you go." I felt a chill run down my spine. What did he mean? A week later, back on the road, I couldn't shake his words. Jenny had gone into hiding, staying with a friend in another state. But I couldn't escape the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of him. Then, one night, as I pulled into a rest stop, I found a note on my windshield. It was scrawled in messy handwriting. "I told you it wasn't over." I looked around, but the rest stop was deserted. My heart raced. How had he found me? What did he want? I got back in the truck, my mind racing. I knew then that this was far from over. The open road, once my sanctuary, had become a place of fear. And as I drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In the weeks that followed, I changed routes and stayed in different motels. But the notes kept coming. Each one was a reminder that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I took Jenny away from him, and he wanted revenge. I knew then that I could never let my guard down. The road was no longer just a place of work, it had become a battleground. And I was in a fight for my life. So, if you ever see a trucker on the highway, remember this story. We may seem like we're just hauling goods from place to place, but some of us are running from something far more sinister. The open road has its own set of rules, and sometimes the monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're right there in the rearview mirror. I slammed my foot on the gas, trying to outrun him. The truck roared to life, but the car stayed right beside us. Jenny woke up, her eyes wide with fear. "Tom, what's going on?" "Hang on, Jenny," I said, my voice tense. "I think it's him." She looked over and saw the car, her face going pale. "Oh my God, it's him, it's him." The car rammed into the side of the truck, and I struggled to keep control. Jenny was screaming, and I could barely hear myself think. I needed to lose this guy, and fast. I spotted an exit up ahead and took it, hoping to lose him on the back roads. The car followed, its headlights still glaring. We tore down a narrow, winding road, the truck's tires screeching on the asphalt. The road ended at an abandoned warehouse. I had no choice but to stop. I jumped out of the cab, Jenny right behind me. The car skidded to a halt, and her boyfriend got out, a crazed look in his eyes. "Get behind me," I told Jenny, stepping forward. "She's mine," he screamed, brandishing a tire iron. "You can't take her from me." I had no weapon, nothing to defend us with, but I couldn't let him take Jenny. I stood my ground, my heart pounding. "Stay away from her," I warned. If he got a hold of her, I could never forgive myself. He lunged at me, swinging the tire iron. I dodged, barely, and grabbed his arm, trying to wrestle the weapon from him. We struggled, the metal clanging against the concrete. Jenny screamed, but there was nothing she could do. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, I managed to knock the tire iron from his hand. He fell to the ground and I stood over him, breathing heavily. "Go," I told Jenny. "Get in the truck. Call the police." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and ran to the truck. Her boyfriend lay on the ground, groaning, but I didn't take my eyes off him. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing. They handcuffed Jenny's boyfriend and took our statements. We were shaken but relieved it was over. As they led him away, he looked back at Jenny with a strange smile. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think you're safe? You're wrong. I'll never let you go." I felt a chill run down my spine. What did he mean? A week later, back on the road, I couldn't shake his words. Jenny had gone into hiding, staying with a friend in another state. But I couldn't escape the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of him. Then, one night, as I pulled into a rest stop, I found a note on my windshield. It was scrawled in messy handwriting. "I told you it wasn't over." I looked around, but the rest stop was deserted. My heart raced. How had he found me? What did he want? I got back in the truck, my mind racing. I knew then that this was far from over. The open road, once my sanctuary, had become a place of fear. And as I drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In the weeks that followed, I changed routes and stayed in different motels. But the notes kept coming. Each one was a reminder that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I took Jenny away from him, and he wanted revenge. I knew then that I could never let my guard down. The road was no longer just a place of work, it had become a battleground. And I was in a fight for my life. So, if you ever see a trucker on the highway, remember this story. We may seem like we're just hauling goods from place to place, but some of us are running from something far more sinister. The open road has its own set of rules, and sometimes the monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're right there in the rearview mirror. I had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight, my eyelids heavy and my mind in a fog. The road stretched out endlessly in front of me, illuminated only by the faint glow of my headlights. I was hauling a load of freight across the country, trying to make good time and beat the deadline. The weather had been deteriorating all evening, and now the sky had opened up in a torrential downpour. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, and lightning flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the darkened landscape. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road, drenched and shivering. It was a woman, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin, her hair plastered to her face. I hesitated for a moment. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something I normally did, especially not in the middle of a storm like this. But something about her seemed so desperate, so helpless, that I couldn't just drive by. I slowed the truck and rolled down the window. "You need a ride?" I shouted over the sound of the rain. She nodded vigorously, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes, please," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. I unlocked the passenger door and she climbed in, soaking the seat instantly. As she settled in, I got a good look at her. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with pale skin and wide, frightened eyes. She looked like she'd been through hell. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been out here for hours. My car broke down a few miles back." "No problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are you headed?" She gave me an address that was a few towns over, and I nodded. "I can take you that far," I said, "but after that you're on your own." She nodded gratefully, and we set off into the night. The rain continued to beat down on the truck, and the road was slick and treacherous. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the relentless patter of the rain. After a few miles, I glanced over at her. She was staring straight ahead, her face pale and expressionless. "So, what happened to your car?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "It just died," she said flatly. "One minute it was fine, and the next it just stopped." "Bad luck," I said, "but you're lucky I came along. Not many people would stop for a hitchhiker these days." She turned to look at me, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Yes," she said softly, "very lucky." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the road, but the unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing mile. As we drove, I couldn't help but notice that the temperature inside the cab was dropping rapidly. I turned up the heat, but it didn't seem to make a difference. I glanced over at my passenger again, and she was still staring straight ahead, her expression unchanged. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. She didn't respond, just continued to stare ahead with that blank, unreadable expression. I felt a surge of fear and anger. What the hell was going on? "Hey," I said more forcefully. "I asked you a question." Still no response. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I reached out to shake her shoulder, and as soon as my hand touched her, she turned to face me. Her eyes were completely black and her mouth twisted into a grotesque, unnatural smile. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice a low, guttural whisper. I jerked my hand back and slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt on the wet road. I turned to look at her, my heart racing, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the door was still locked from the inside. I sat there for a moment, my mind reeling. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I losing my mind? I looked around, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Just the rain and the dark, empty road. I drove the rest of the way in a daze, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I finally reached my destination, I couldn't get out of the truck fast enough. I never told anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? But every time I drive that stretch of road, I can't help but look for her, standing there in the rain, waiting for her next ride. Driving a truck cross-country isn't for the faint of heart. Long hours on the road, the constant hum of the engine and the endless horizon can make you feel like you're the only person left in the world. But it's not the loneliness that gets to you. It's the things you see out there, on the open road, in the dead of night. My name is Ray, and this is the story of the night I stopped at the abandoned rest stop off Highway 24. I'd been driving for nearly 14 hours straight. My eyes were gritty from lack of sleep, and the caffeine wasn't doing much anymore. I needed a place to pull over and catch some shut-eye before I drove off the road. That's when I saw the sign. Rest stop, 2 miles ahead. It was old and faded, barely readable, but it was a godsend. The rest stop wasn't listed on my GPS, which was strange. Still, I couldn't afford to be picky. As I pulled off the highway, the road turned from smooth asphalt to rough gravel, crunching under my tires. The rest stop came into view, and my heart sank a bit. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The lights were out, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. I parked my truck and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional screech of some nocturnal bird. The place gave off a bad vibe, but I was too tired to care. I climbed into the sleeper cab, locked the doors, and lay down, hoping to get a few hours of sleep. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up. It couldn't have been more than an hour or two. Something had pulled me out of a deep sleep. A noise. It sounded like whispering. I sat up, my heart pounding. The cab was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight through the windshield. I held my breath and listened. The whispering continued, a chorus of voices just outside my truck. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but it was like they were speaking in some strange, guttural language. Gathering my courage, I peeked out the window. The rest stop was empty, not a soul in sight. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I lay back down and closed my eyes. But the moment I did, the whispering started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The whispering stopped as soon as my feet hit the ground. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The rest stop was in worse shape than I'd realized. The bathroom building was boarded up, the vending machines smashed, and the picnic tables overturned. It looked like a place that had seen more than just neglect. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. I walked around the side of the building, the flashlight flickering. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows. My heart leapt into my throat. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, his clothes hanging off him like rags. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. I took a step back, my hand tightening on the flashlight. Then just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, like a shadow dissolving into the night. I backed away, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I hurried back to my truck, locking the door behind me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. The whispering began again, louder this time, surrounding the truck, filling the cab with their eerie chant. Finally, the engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into gear and tore out of there, the tires skidding on the gravel. As I pulled onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The rest stop was dark and still, but for a split second, I saw them. Dozens of figures standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching me leave. I drove straight through to the next town, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. When I finally pulled into a well-lit, populated truck stop, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I never spoke of what I saw that night, but I never took that route again. And every time I pass a rest stop sign, I think of those whispers and those glowing eyes. And I keep driving, never looking back. If you're ever driving down Highway 24 and see a sign for a rest stop that isn't on your map, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Some places are abandoned for a reason. I had been on the road for hours. The hum of the engine and the monotony of the highway starting to lull me into a drowsy state. Beside me, my girlfriend Lisa was already nodding off, her head resting gently against the window. We were somewhere in the middle of nowhere on Route 66, a stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. The sun had long since set, and the night was cloaked in darkness, save for the occasional flash of headlights from passing cars. Just as my eyelids grew heavy, I spotted a flickering neon sign in the distance. Route 66 Diner, it read. It was a welcome sight. I nudged Lisa awake, and she groggily looked around. "We need a break," I said. "How about some coffee and a bathroom stop?" Lisa nodded, rubbing her eyes. I pulled the truck into the gravel parking lot, the tires crunching beneath us. The diner looked like something out of a vintage postcard, with its chrome exterior and checkered floor visible through the windows. But there was something off. It looked too pristine, like it had been preserved in time. We stepped inside, and a small bell above the door jingled. The place was empty, not a soul in sight. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and something else, something metallic. I couldn't quite place it. A jukebox in the corner played faint jazz music, and the distant hum of whispered conversations seemed to fill the air, though the diner appeared deserted. Lisa tugged at my sleeve, her eyes wide. "This place is creepy, Jake," she whispered. I had to agree, but I didn't want to let on. "It's just old," I said, trying to sound confident. "Come on, let's find a seat." We chose a booth by the window, and as we sat down, I noticed an old clock on the wall. It was stuck at 2:15, its hands frozen in time. A menu lay on the table, its edges yellowed with age. I picked it up and flipped through it, the pages crackling under my fingers. Just then, We heard footsteps. A waitress emerged from the back, her uniform crisp and clean, but her eyes were hollow, devoid of any life. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What can I get you folks?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Lisa and I exchanged glances. "Just coffee for now," I said. The waitress nodded and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty diner. Lisa leaned in closer to me. "I don't like this place, Jake. Something's not right." I squeezed her hand. "We'll be fine. We'll have our coffee and get back on the road." Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the back of the diner, followed by an eerie silence. The waitress returned with our coffee, her smile still plastered on her face. "Everything okay back there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer, just set the coffee down and walked away. Lisa's hand trembled as she reached for her cup. "Let's just drink this and go," she whispered. As we sipped our coffee, I noticed the clock on the wall had started ticking again, the hands moving slowly towards 2:15. A chill ran down my spine. "Jake, look," Lisa said, pointing to the window. Outside, the parking lot was no longer empty. Old rusted cars filled the spaces, and shadowy figures moved among them. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "We need to leave. Now," I said, standing up. But as we headed for the door, it slammed shut on its own, the lock clicking into place. We were trapped. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped, our breath visible in the cold air. The whispers grew louder, and the sound of crying filled the diner. I turned to see the ghostly figures of people in the booths, their faces twisted in agony. Lisa screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the back of the diner. "There's got to be another way out," I shouted over the noise. We burst into the kitchen, the clanging of pots and pans filling the air. The metallic smell was stronger here, almost overpowering. I gagged, and Lisa clung to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Jake, what is this place?" she cried. I had no answers. All I knew was that we had to get out. We stumbled through the kitchen, the whispers following us, growing louder and more urgent. Then suddenly, everything went silent. The whispers, the crying, all gone. It was as if the diner was holding its breath. But before I could process it, a loud banging started on the walls, like someone or something was trying to break through. We found a door at the back of the kitchen and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Lisa sobbed, and I felt a surge of desperation. I slammed my shoulder against the door, again and again, until finally it gave way. We stumbled out into the cold night, the darkness swallowing us whole. I glanced back and saw the diner still lit up, the figures inside staring out at us with hollow eyes. We ran to the truck, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, tearing out of the parking lot. As we sped down the highway, the diner faded into the distance, but the fear lingered. The radio crackled with static, and faint voices whispered through the speakers. I turned it off, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. Lisa was shaking beside me, tears streaming down her face. "What was that place, Jake?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but we're never going back." As we drove through the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something truly evil. The Route 66 Diner was a place trapped in time, a place where the dead still roamed, reliving their final moments over and over. And as we left it behind, I knew we would carry the memory of that night with us forever, a haunting reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the most unexpected places. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon when I left my hometown for what felt like the last time. It was a bittersweet moment, driving away from the only place I'd ever known. I was off to college miles away, but before that, I had plans to spend a few days with my girlfriend, Emily, who lived close to the college. We had been dating for almost 2 years, and the thought of being closer to her was the only thing keeping my nerves at bay. As luck would have it, about 3 hours into my trip, my car began to sputter. I looked at the dashboard and saw the temperature gauge creeping into the red. I had no choice but to pull over. I got out, popped the hood, and was met with a cloud of steam. Great. Stranded in the middle of nowhere with no phone connection. My map had shown a straight route, but this road wasn't even listed. It was as if I'd taken a wrong turn into oblivion. Night fell quickly. The dense forest on either side of the road seemed to swallow the last rays of daylight, leaving me in near darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight and began checking the engine, hoping it was something simple I could fix. I was engrossed in my work when I heard it, the low, rumbling growl of a truck engine. Relief washed over me as the lights of a large truck pierced the darkness. I waved, trying to signal for help. The truck slowed, its headlights bathing me in a blinding white light. The truck stopped, and the driver's side door creaked open. But instead of stepping out, the figure inside just sat there, staring. I couldn't make out any details in the glare of the headlights. "Hey, can you help me?" I called out. There was no response. The truck idled for a few more seconds, then the door slammed shut, and the truck roared to life again, driving off into the darkness. I was left standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe they didn't see me properly, I reasoned. I went back to my car trying to calm my nerves, but soon enough I heard the truck again. The same rumbling growl, the same blinding lights. This time the truck didn't stop. It sped up, barreling down the road straight towards me. I jumped out of the way, diving into the ditch as the truck roared past, missing me by inches. My heart was in my throat. What the hell was going on? I got up, dusting myself off, and looked around. The truck was gone, but I knew it would be back. I could feel it. I grabbed a tire iron from my trunk, not knowing what else to do, and waited. Sure enough, the truck came back. Over and over, it circled like a predator, its lights sweeping the road. Each time it came closer, forcing me to dive into the bushes, scramble over rocks, anything to avoid getting hit. I was exhausted, terrified, and starting to lose hope when the truck disappeared again. The silence was almost worse than the constant growl of the engine. I decided to leave my car and find help on foot. I walked for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in around me. The road seemed to stretch endlessly with no sign of another vehicle or a house. Then, out of nowhere, the truck's headlights flared to life behind me. I ran, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. The truck bore down on me, its horn blaring. Just as I thought it would run me over, it swerved violently and disappeared into the trees. I collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath. That's when I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, a small, weathered sign covered in vines. Old Route 13 closed. My blood ran cold. Route 13 had been closed for decades after a series of tragic accidents, including a trucker who had gone mad and driven his rig off the road, killing himself in the process. Legend had it that his spirit still haunted the road, tormenting anyone who dared to travel it. But the twist came when I realized I wasn't alone in my torment. On the ground, near the sign, was another flashlight, another tire iron, and a phone, dead but with a cracked screen showing a missed call from a number I recognized, my own. In that moment, it hit me. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. The trucker's spirit wasn't just haunting the road. It was reliving its own torment and dragging others into its nightmare. I never did make it to Emily's. By morning, a passing motorist found me, disheveled and half-mad, wandering the road. My car was towed, and I was given a ride to the nearest town. I transferred to a different college, far from Route 13. But sometimes late at night, I can still hear the growl of a truck engine, the blare of a horn, and the phantom whisper of a lost soul searching for peace. And that's my story. As the night deepens and the roads grow darker, these tales of terror remind us that the open highway holds more than just destinations. It harbors nightmares. From phantom truckers to haunted byways, these stories reveal the sinister side of trucking. Thanks for joining us on this eerie journey. If you enjoyed these spine-tingling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest horror stories. Drive safe, and remember, on the roads of Nightshade Horror Hub, every turn could lead to a new nightmare.